We're joined today by State Representative Paul Schemel. You're sponsoring a bill, House Bill 2281, to reduce the penalty for possessing marijuana. Can you tell us a little bit about your proposal?
Sure. So my proposal comes out of the Health Committee hearings that we had with regard largely to recreational marijuana. But one issue that came up again and again was a matter of equity and who was being arrested, when they were being arrested, and so forth. Demographically, found lower income folks, a lot of folks from the Black and Brown community, report being arrested more frequently on this kind of offense. There are multiple reasons for that, which is interesting, but as a low-hanging fruit, I thought it would be good to change this to a summary offense. Talking to district attorneys and judges, not too many people are actually being prosecuted for this. This still gives tools to prosecutors if there's a problem in front of a house or on a particular street with these kinds of exchanges, but without such a draconian penalty.
Now, you've historically opposed legalizing recreational marijuana. Can you put that in context with your stance on this bill that you're proposing?
Yeah, some might see a dichotomy here. I still very staunchly oppose recreational marijuana. But even under recreational marijuana, marijuana sales on the street would still be illegal. This is really more a way to address those low-level, simple offenses where people have a small amount. Similar to if someone had a small amount of some other prohibited item, but it's just treated as a summary offense or like a speeding ticket. This again is how DAs tell us that they are typically prosecuting or would want to see this prosecuted. So I think that it's consistent with our notions of what is just in a case like this versus what's not just. And it's certainly differentiated from the concept of legalizing marijuana as a recreational product.
Now, you just mentioned support from district attorneys. Tell me a little bit more about what you've heard from the law enforcement community and the reaction to your bill.
So I've spoken a lot to both police, district attorneys, and judges. And I always ask, so how often are you prosecuting or do you see prosecuted individuals for simple possession? A number of years ago in the Judiciary Committee and in the House of Representatives, we passed legislation that would prevent people from sort of getting bounced back into the system on parole or probation for possession of small amounts. So we already have addressed this in that sense, but those law enforcement officials say, well, we seldom are seeing anyone that's really being prosecuted for a misdemeanor offense of this nature. Usually we just tell them to, we confiscate the contraband, tell them to move along. But sometimes it would be good to have a penalty, something that's a little less than a full misdemeanor. That's why we came up with the summary offense in this case.
How are your colleagues in the House reacting?
Most of my colleagues in the House, I usually have to explain, this is not legalizing. It's not about legalizing marijuana. It's really about putting the penalty where it belongs or what is an appropriate penalty. I think there's a lot of support for it. Many people are watching to see what the House leadership will do with recreational marijuana and how this may or may not fit into that larger program.
Where's your bill in the legislative process?
Right now, it's been assigned to the Judiciary Committee. I'm on the Judiciary Committee, so I'm going to be encouraging the Representative Briggs, who's the chair of the committee, to run the bill. And after that, if it gets run, hopefully it would go to the House floor.
Governor Josh Shapiro is proposing legalizing recreational marijuana with the anticipation of generating $250 million in tax revenue within 5 years. How do you balance the potential for new revenue with societal costs?
So legislators are policymakers. Our job is really to look at what is the appropriate policy that provides for the health, safety, and welfare of the people of Pennsylvania. I always kind of liken that to a set of scales. If you put one thing on one side and you balance it out with those things in the other. Take, for example, something we do every year when we pass the budget, which we're getting ready to do. We always look at, okay, what about taxes? No one likes to pay taxes. I'm certainly in that category. You probably are as well. But we balance that out with the good that tax money can be used, for the betterment of society. So that's how I view all legislation. All legislation fits into that same balancing of good and bad. When you put recreational marijuana on that balance scale, what are the good and what are the bad? Governor Shapiro and others say, well, the good is that we're going to get this revenue. And they also say, oh, and we're not going to be prosecuting people unnecessarily for, something like simple possession. But what is the bad? We went through 5 different hearings, I think over 25 different testifiers, mostly individuals called by those who are in support of legalizing recreational marijuana. To a person, every single one of those testifiers indicated 2 things that are really important. Number one, that in states or provinces, because we also analyzed Canada, that have legalized recreational marijuana, that it's normalized marijuana, and that they've seen the use of marijuana go up. So that's number one. Number two, when it comes to the illicit market, that's the black market, we've seen that in the states and provinces that have legalized marijuana, that the black market has either increased or remained the same. So there's been no diminution of the black market. So if I put those two things on the balance, I say, okay, if the good is that we get some additional tax revenue that can be used to spend on different things, what is the bad? The bad is A, we've got more people utilizing marijuana. In fact, statistically, we see that 60% of the people that use marijuana use it every day. That's everyday use of marijuana. Does anyone think that's a good thing? And then secondly, we don't see any diminution of the black market. So we still have people illicitly selling marijuana outside of even the legal system. And of course, you're not gaining any tax revenue on those individuals. So as I balance that out as a policymaker, I say there's not enough good to be gained from the bad that we know that we're going to incur. And keep in mind, that's the bad or ill effects that we know we're going to incur. 25 states or 24 states have so far legalized recreational marijuana. We have their record to explore and to examine to see what has happened. We know the societal costs. In the provinces of Canada, we heard testimony from Quebec, which has probably had the most conservative legalization of recreational marijuana. In that case, they were saying, well, actually, most of the revenue that we gain from the legal sale of marijuana goes right back into the social system to try to address the ill effects on society that we've seen. So what's the exchange there for the people of Pennsylvania if we're going to be reinvesting whatever tax revenue we hope to get to try to fix the problems that are created by the public policy that we would be passing?
There was some talk in those hearings about the potential for a state-run system, something akin to what the state does with the Liquor Control Board. Can you talk a little bit about your views on that and any benefits of having a state-run system?
Yeah, right now amongst those who are interested in legalizing, they sort of fall into two camps. One camp is, well, the state should just sell licenses kind of like it does with beer stores. And the second camp is that the state should run the system kind of like we do with liquor stores. Now, keep in mind, when did the state start that program? It's after Prohibition. That was Governor Pinchot, himself, who was a teetotaler, said he was going to make it as difficult as possible for Pennsylvanians to have a drink of liquor. So he started the state stores so we could carefully control that. What's happened since that time? Fast forward to today, the state of Pennsylvania is the largest purchaser of alcohol in the world. If you look at the costs of employees and all the benefits that go into that, including the pension system, we actually lose money on its sale. We have to advertise alcohol in order to sell it just to not even break even on the system. So that's, if we're looking at now creating another system for marijuana based upon a model that's kind of a failing business model already there, we did explore what the province of Quebec does. And Quebec does something very similar to that. They have state-run stores. They have very carefully controlled product sales. For those who are more conservative, who want to legalize recreational marijuana, but maybe fall on the side of having some concerns, then perhaps that would be the route to go. They very carefully control the nature of the products that are sold. There's no edibles like brownies and so forth that you can purchase in Quebec. All the packaging is, I would call it boring packaging. It doesn't have the type of packaging that's going to appeal to children. And the amount of THC in the product is very carefully regulated, so you don't have high THC products. Quebec is unique. Among the states that have legalized in Pennsylvania and the other provinces of Canada, none have done that. It remains to be seen if there's much support for it. And also keep in mind that the state has a monopoly on the sale of liquor and wine, generally speaking, except for those products that are actually produced in Pennsylvania. So the state has that monopoly. We sell it through state stores, but there's no federal offense, no federal felony for the sale of alcohol. There would remain to be a federal felony for the sale of marijuana, unless, of course, that changes on the national level.
As you mentioned that, would additional security provisions be required, and how would that work if some system similar to the LCB were to take over sales and regulation of marijuana?
We don't know, because if we had something like the LCB, those are state employees. We still don't know how we would handle a state employee that actually is committing a felony by selling marijuana, which is a federally scheduled drug that has no beneficial use currently. So we're not sure how that would work, A. We could contract that. That's been one discussion. That could be contracted to a third party to promote those sales. We still have issues with banking. So, as long as the state law and the federal law are misaligned in this area, I think that becomes very challenging. Other states have not gone the route of having state sales. I can't tell you why, but part of it might be that they were unable to resolve those differences as well. And by just putting it over into the private market, they generally didn't have to deal with it. But we'll see going forward. Again, I know that there's certainly a significant interest on the part of some of the legislators, including and most particularly Representative Dan Frankel, the chair of the Health Committee.
Do entities that have a state-run type system, such as Canada, do they have a better handle over minimizing the black market?
So the only province that actually has that is Quebec. The other provinces in Canada have all just a privatized sale of recreational marijuana. And Quebec is kind of an interesting study. In the analysis we had from Quebec and the testimony we had from Quebec, they actually had a much smaller illicit market prior to legalization. I don't really know why that is. It might be cultural on the part of the people of Quebec, or it might just be bad data, but probably some combination of the two, but probably more cultural than anything else. They've also reported lower usage than the rest of Canadians in other provinces. So certainly, the controlled sale of it, normally speaking, we would say the more you control the sale of legalized recreational marijuana, the more you're going to see in the illicit market, because people want higher THC products. They want more variety in products. They also want broader sales. So if you don't have products that are sweetened and taste like candy, and there are people that want products that are sweetened and taste like candy, then the illicit market will fill that gap. If you don't have products that have high THC levels, then the illicit market will fill that gap. I think that's why we've seen other states that have legalized recreational marijuana start with a lot of controlled measures and then eventually loosen those controlled measures. They've done that not because they want people to have higher THC products or have products that are more geared toward children. They've done that to try to rein in the illicit market, which has grown in those states after legalization.
As we consider those recent hearings before the House Health Committee, what other lessons has the committee learned from other states and entities that have legalized marijuana?
So interestingly, every testifier we had who was testifying as to the method or mode of legalization within their state told us, don't do what we did. Learn from the mistakes we made. But in many respects, those mistakes are really unavoidable. There are some states that, like the state of Oregon, which really just opened up all sales of everything with very few restrictions. And they would say, well, that was not good because we had people that were overdosing or people that were utilizing the wrong way or too much. We've had other states that have seen a lot of what I would refer to as mission creep, where they started with very controlled, a lot of control mechanisms. The illicit market was filling in the gaps, so they, slowly loosened those things up. But one thing we know is that once marijuana is legalized for recreational purposes, to differentiate that from medical purposes, which we already have, legalized for recreational purposes, then it becomes a normalized product. I was kind of liken it to purchasing a scalp ticket at a football game. Once you're in the stadium and seated at your seat, you just have a ticket like anyone else has a ticket. How did you obtain the ticket? If you went on Ticketmaster and bought the ticket in a legitimate fashion, then you obtained it legally and you're sitting in the seat using the ticket. If you bought the ticket illegally in the park from a scalper, you still enter the stadium with the ticket and you're seated in the seat with the ticket. So once you've normalized the product, whether you've purchased it on the illicit market or from the licit market, it's undifferentiatable, and people don't really see a differentiation either in the use of the product. They don't know, well, maybe higher THC is not good, or maybe this one is, because it's not regulated, I bought it on the black market, I don't really know what's in it. So, that's a danger that you risk with, any time that you normalize a product.
Some of the House Democratic proposals include a social equity status where licensing priority would be given to minority-owned businesses and those that are based in communities that have been affected negatively by drugs. What is your opinion of the potential for a social equity status in some sort of proposal?
We heard a fair amount of testimony with regard to social equity. Actually, that's one of the reasons that I introduced my own bill that would make the possession of a simple possession the summary offense, because of the impact this has had largely on that same community. One of the testifiers, who was formerly a criminal judge in Allegheny County, had explained this as the difference between the street and the suite. And she said, in a poorer neighborhood, drug transactions or sale of marijuana takes place out in the open in the street because there's nowhere else for that to occur. Therefore, it tends to get picked up by police. People see it out in front of their homes and they complain. And these are very out in the open type transactions versus suburban areas or higher income areas where these types of transactions occur largely inside, unseen. If they're unseen, they're unreported. People don't see them as a problem. Her testimony was that we probably have as much transaction with drugs and marijuana in poorer neighborhoods, Black and brown communities, as we do in wealthier neighborhoods. We just don't see it. It's not out in the open. So, that there is definitely a component in the way this has been enforced, the way drug laws, marijuana laws have been enforced in the past. Um, Now, in terms of equity going forward, if the state were to legalize marijuana as a recreational product, some of the proposals would be to, well, if we're going to grant licenses to private parties, then do they segment a certain number of those licenses to individuals that meet certain qualifications? There were testifiers to say that's a good idea. It hasn't worked in other states. First off, there are potentially constitutional issues with doing that. But secondly, and more importantly, if you have a license that's freely transferable, then a person A can purchase and acquire the license from the state initially, but then sell it to person B. So if person A is a person of color that purchases the license under a special license, if they have a license that's worth as much as any other license, like any other license, then it's freely transferable. In a number of states that have legalized recreational marijuana, what happens is large corporations end up owning all the licenses, regardless of who might have been the initial acquirer of the license. So is there really a matter of racial justice or equity if a black and brown individual is the first person to own the license, and then within a year or 2 years or 3 years, they just simply sell it to a corporation? You've made one individual wealthy, you really haven't benefited the community. Another thing I think that's important to follow along these lines is, what is the impact on communities of color of this kind of program, of any sort of legalization? One of the testifiers we had from the state of Colorado said if you look at a map of where all the marijuana dispensaries or sale points are, they're almost all in low-income communities. Is that a good thing? Is it a good thing that low-income communities bear the burden of having these sale points? They're really selling a controlled substance, of course. So is that really equitable? Is that the kind of equity we want to see?
What effect would legalizing marijuana have on crime?
So the illicit market doesn't go away. In fact, in some ways, there becomes a sort of a stronger push to try to enforce laws, because if you have legal sale of recreational marijuana, then those individuals that have spent a great deal of money purchasing a legal license and operating a store suddenly become very interested in you enforcing the marijuana laws against the illicit market. And they put a lot of pressure on policymakers, police, and district attorneys to do just that. So it certainly does not make the crime element of it go away. Now, from the purchaser standpoint, if you have someone purchasing marijuana from a legal market, obviously if it's within whatever the law says the legal capability of them to have is, then they've not violated the state law. They still violated federal law, still a federal felony. We'll see what the federal government does about that.
What do you think about concerns of marijuana being considered a gateway drug, and how does that fit into the whole discussion of legalization?
We've heard some testimony of individuals saying that it is a gateway drug. It's a controlled substance. It certainly has an impact on people's ability to think and reason, work and do things, operate equipment and so forth. Is it a gateway drug? There's evidence to indicate that it is. There are also individuals that say that there's evidence to indicate that it's not. I'm not an addiction specialist, but I certainly do know, from the testimony we've received, the impact that it has on someone's ability to think, reason, and perform tasks. That's my primary concern. If it leads to other drug use, again, there's indications that it does, but even if you don't believe that it does, it in itself is still a harmful thing to society.
Can the same be said of alcohol or nicotine?
Absolutely, but I think there's a false comparison sometimes between alcohol and certainly a nicotine, but even alcohol. So nicotine is a stimulant, and it can have an effect that makes people, certainly we know that it can have an effect that makes people addicted to it. Alcohol, sometimes people make this false comparison. Well, alcohol and marijuana are the same. And I say that's really not the comparison. The comparison is drunkenness and marijuana, because you can have a drink and your ability to operate vehicles and so forth, your ability to reason is not really diminished in any significant sense. But if you become drunk, if you've had a few drinks, then it certainly is. Marijuana, on the other hand, is actually consumed for the very purpose of achieving that high, which also comes with it comes, a diminution of your motor skills, a diminution of your ability to reason, and other things like that. So that's the true comparison. So we compare marijuana with drunkenness, but both have a significant impact on society. It's a negative impact on society. It can be addictive, I'm sure, just the way that other products that people tend to get addicted to: gambling, alcohol, nicotine, other drugs.
We often hear that Pennsylvania is in the midst of an opioid crisis, and there have been state efforts to to combat that in recent years. Would legalizing marijuana send a mixed message?
I think that it does, but I don't compare opioids to marijuana. They're two distinct things with different impacts on individuals. Opioids are highly addictive, and they are a legal product which can be consumed, under a doctor's direction and so forth. Marijuana is too, is a product that can be consumed for medical purposes under a doctor's direction. But I would be careful to compare the two. I don't think that marijuana, its effect on the individual, at least I haven't seen any indication that it's the same as opioids. But certainly, we look at and have always and traditionally looked at marijuana as a drug. It is a drug. And, if you're legalizing one drug, does it give people the general sense that other drugs are okay as well? I suppose there's always a risk for that, but I prefer to look at marijuana as a drug in its own right, and what impact it would have in its own right.
Is there any correlation between states that have legal marijuana and the incidence of vehicular accidents?
We've heard testimony to indicate that vehicular accidents have increased in those states. Insurance rates in some states have increased. It's actually a lot of employers, particularly manufacturers, and I have manufacturers in my district who lobby against it because they say it's difficult for them, they can't test for it. One of the challenges with, we have a test system for alcohol, we can test it. We can test it on the scene, through a breathalyzer. But for marijuana, there's nothing that's similar to that. There's a blood test that obviously, unless you're traveling with a phlebotomist, you're not going to do a blood test in the field. So there are field tests that they can do to indicate how inebriated or how impacted someone is by marijuana, but they're not always good tests or accurate tests. Employers complain that when someone shows up to work and they're going to be operating equipment, there's really no effective tests that they can do for that. In fact, that's part of the problem with marijuana is that it can show up in your system much longer in the future when really someone might no longer be impacted, inebriated or anything like that. So it's a difficult one to test for. But in those states that have had it, they have noted, an increase in vehicular accidents, which they believe to be due to marijuana use.
What are the health impacts of marijuana?
That we don't know. Smoking anything, we should know at this point, is not good. Of course, some of these are in the form in some states of edibles. Eating too many brownies, probably not good either, just in its own right, whether they have marijuana in them or not. But there's a lot that we don't know about marijuana. And honestly, that's part of when we passed the medical marijuana law in Pennsylvania a few years ago. With it was supposed to be research that the state was going to fund through the medical marijuana program. Very little research has been done. In some ways, I kind of welcome the rescheduling, if the federal government does, of marijuana. It makes it easier for researchers to research the impact of marijuana, both in the medical program, which has indicated there could be some positive elements to that for people that suffer from different ailments. But there also might be research then that would lead us to understand more of the other impacts that marijuana can have, particularly marijuana consumed for recreational purposes on an individual. Sadly and tragically, it took us too long to kind of know what those effects would be with smoking. I read recently a statistic, and I don't recall where it was, that said that daily use of marijuana has now surpassed daily use of cigarettes.
Would legalizing marijuana also increase the burden on the healthcare system, people seeking additional healthcare needs as a result of that usage?
Every testifier we had that was familiar with the social system within their state or province indicated that after legalization of recreational marijuana, that the state had seen, or I should say that hospitals and medical facilities had seen a significant uptick in the number of individuals that are being impacted, psychologically, and particularly psychologically, sometimes with other health ills. Asthma or respiratory issues and so forth, but particularly the psychological effect. There's a lot there that we don't know. We had testimony that indicated that rates of schizophrenia had increased. We don't know, does marijuana cause schizophrenia or does it just exacerbate those who maybe already have schizophrenia? So hopefully research in the future will help to answer some of those questions. I'd just rather not be experimenting with the people of Pennsylvania, that's all.
Are there lessons that can be learned from the tobacco industry, for example, that particularly not only when you're determining whether or not to legalize, but in particular, how to protect minors?
Yeah, certainly. So packaging, and we've seen that from some of the states, but particularly, once again, the province of Quebec, which is very limiting on the packaging, not having packaging that is attractive to children. I would think the same with advertising. There are some states and provinces that don't have much in the way of restrictions. A lot of the advertising looks like you're advertising for candy shops. that should be somewhat telling as to who the marijuana industry thinks that they're going to attract to the sale of the product. So I think there's a lot to be learned from the tobacco industry in that. Tragically, the ill effects of it we didn't see until too late. It can be a genie out of the bottle. What do you do to the person who is already addicted to cigarettes to tell them to stop smoking? I often tell children, school children and so forth, that I don't know any adult, someone like beyond their early 20s, who smokes cigarettes who didn't wish every day that they could quit. I don't know anyone in that category. Every smoker I know who smokes wishes they could quit, but they can't because they're addicted to the product. So if we have products, legalized, for example, legalized recreational marijuana that people are using on a daily basis, 61% of the people who use it say they use it daily. Then there's an addictive quality there that is what? Largely it's being smoked or consumed perhaps as an edible, and we don't know yet what the long-term effects of that will be.
Do you think the issue of marijuana legalization will be tied into the budget process this year?
The governor certainly wants to tie it in because he's already tagged a certain dollar figure on what he thinks that will raise. It's early in the budget process. I haven't heard that. There's certainly some that would require any sort of illegal marijuana program to get started in place very soon. And certainly those who want to do something through something like a state store, we're nowhere close to being ready to do that. So I doubt it'll be part of the budget for this year. It could be that they're leading up to trying something for next year.
Do you think the existence of legalization in neighboring states has had an impact on the sentiment of lawmakers?
So there's definitely this false narrative that we're losing money. I always hear this. Well, we're losing money to Maryland. I live right on the Maryland line, so I hear this a lot. Maryland's legalized recreational marijuana. So I don't accept I don't accept that. And here's why. I mean, we could legalize anything, we can tax anything, and collect money on it. So just because we're not taxing something doesn't mean we're missing out on income. Again, I'm a policymaker, so I think of the broader policy. Certainly, as I said earlier, when you legalize something, it becomes normalized. I travel into the state of Maryland a lot, down in Washington, D.C. I have a son who's in college there. In both of those two locations, marijuana is legalized for recreational use. And almost every time I travel into both locations, I smell it. I smell it in the parking lot, I smell it on the street, I smell it in the store, I smell it at the ball game. So does that have an impact on people here? I would say that it does, but one state does not have to accept the bad policy choices of another. And I think we fall into a trap if we convince ourselves that it's inevitable, that we have to do it because other states have done it. There are plenty of things that we do. I live right on the Mason-Dixon line. If that's not a better example of why we don't always follow the policy of another state, I don't know what would be. Not trying to equate all things together, but just say we don't have to accept the bad policy decisions of another state.
Representative Paul Schemel, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Francine. My pleasure.